The Texas heat had finally eased, giving way to a warm but bearable evening. The sky stretched out in deep purple hues as Ethan Walker drove down a quiet stretch of highway outside Austin, Texas. It had been a long day at his auto shop. His hands were still streaked with grease, his muscles aching from hours under the hood of an old Chevy pickup. All he wanted was a cold beer and sleep. Then he saw her. A silver sedan was pulled over on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing in the dimming light, and next to it stood a woman. Ethan slowed down, his military instincts kicking in. Something about the way she stood, arms crossed, weight shifting uneasily, sent a small warning through his gut. But she was alone, and it was late. Ethan sighed, pulling off onto the shoulder. He killed the engine, stepped out of his truck, and approached cautiously. "You all right, ma'am?" he called. The woman turned, her blonde hair catching the last of the sunlight. Her eyes, sharp, watchful, studied him for a split second before softening. She looked like she belonged in a corporate office, not stranded on a highway. Her fitted blazer and skirt were slightly wrinkled, and there was a faint smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Flat tire," she said, exhaling. "I have a spare, but I have no idea how to change it." Ethan nodded. "I can help with that." Relief flickered across her face. "Thank you, really." Ethan grabbed his toolkit and jack from the back of his truck and knelt beside the car. "You from around here?" he asked, loosening the lug nuts. A hesitation. Then, "No, just passing through." Her voice was calm, but there was something else beneath it, something guarded. Ethan filed it away in his mind, focusing on the task. Within minutes, he had the flat tire off and was securing the spare. As he tightened the last bolt, he noticed the woman stealing quick glances down the road, like she was expecting someone, or worried someone might find her. Ethan stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "All set," he said, studying her reaction. The woman let out a deep breath, but she still looked on edge. "You're a lifesaver," she said. "How much do I owe you?" Ethan chuckled. "Nothing." She blinked, surprised. "Seriously," he said. "Just take care of yourself, all right?" For a moment, she just looked at him. Then she gave a small nod. "Thank you, Ethan." He froze. He hadn't told her his name. His chest tightened slightly. "Do I know you?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. The woman's lips curled into a faint, unreadable smile. "No," she said simply. "But I know you." Then before he could ask more, she slipped into the car, started the engine, and disappeared into the night. Ethan stood there, watching the taillights vanish. Something about the entire interaction felt wrong, like he had just stepped into something much bigger than a flat tire. And by tomorrow morning, he'd realize just how right he was. Ethan drove home in silence, the events of the evening still turning in his head. There was something about that woman, something that felt off. Her clothes, her demeanor. She didn't look like someone who would be driving through back roads at sunset, alone. And then there was the way she had said his name. "But I know you." Ethan exhaled sharply as he turned onto the gravel driveway leading to his house. It was a modest place, tucked away from the city, just the way he liked it. A small auto shop out back, a porch with an old rocking chair, and acres of land separating him from the rest of the world. The kind of place where no one should be able to find him. And yet, she knew him. He killed the engine, stepped out, and stretched. The night air was cooler now, but there was a stillness that didn't sit right with him, like the calm before a storm. Shaking off the unease, he made his way inside, locking the door behind him. He grabbed a cold beer from the fridge, sat down in his worn-out recliner, and turned on the news. Breaking news tonight: corporate mogul Richard Langley is under increasing scrutiny after new allegations. Ethan barely listened. His mind was still back on the woman on the side of the road. Rebecca. Something told him that she wasn't just some stranded driver, and something else told him, whatever trouble she was in, it wasn't over yet. The next morning, an unwanted visitor. Ethan woke up early, as always. His body was conditioned to routine, a habit left over from his military days. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was crisp, the world was quiet, and then he saw it. Parked down the road, just beyond the tree line, A black SUV. Ethan's grip tightened around his coffee mug. It wasn't one of his neighbors. No one drove out here unless they had a reason. And something told him whoever was in that SUV wasn't lost. He watched it for a long moment. It didn't move, didn't turn on its headlights, didn't make a sound, just sat there, waiting. A slow, uneasy feeling crept down his spine. He wasn't a paranoid man, but he also wasn't stupid. Someone was watching him. And the only thing that had changed in the last 24 hours? Rebecca Hale. Ethan set down his coffee and went inside. If someone thought they could sit outside his home and make him nervous, they had another thing coming. He had been through worse. And if they were looking for a fight, they'd better be ready. Ethan Walker never ignored his instincts. And right now, they were screaming at him. The black SUV was still there, just beyond the tree line, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. Ethan stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, eyes locked on the vehicle. It hadn't moved, hadn't revved its engine, just sat there, watching. Ethan's jaw tightened. He was used to people keeping their distance. That's why he lived out here. But this was different. He set his coffee down on the porch railing, grabbed his shotgun from just inside the door, and started walking. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he moved toward the SUV. A direct approach. No games. No intimidation tactics. If they wanted to watch him, they'd have to do it up close. But then, the SUV started its engine, and just like that, it peeled away. Ethan broke into a run, closing the distance fast, but the vehicle was already kicking up dust, disappearing down the road. By the time he reached the spot where it had been parked, it was gone. But something caught his eye. A footprint in the dirt, just beside the road. Someone had been standing there, watching him. Ethan stared down at the mark, his fingers tightening around his shotgun. Whatever this was, it wasn't random, and it sure as hell wasn't over. Inside the house, the call. An hour later, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, his shotgun still within arm's reach. He had tried to push past the unease, started working on an old engine, hoping the familiar rhythm would clear his mind. It didn't. And when his phone rang, he nearly didn't answer. But the number was blocked. His pulse kicked up. He hesitated, then picked up. Walker. A moment of silence. Then a low, steady voice. Walk away. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? You don't need to know, the voice said. But you do need to listen. Stay away from Rebecca Hale. Ethan stood slowly, his body going rigid. So that was it. This was about her. You have the wrong guy, Ethan said, keeping his tone level. I don't even know her. Another beat of silence. Then, a dark chuckle. You do now. The line went dead. Ethan lowered the phone, his heartbeat steady but quick. He had been in bad situations before. And this was about to get a whole lot worse. Ethan stared at the phone in his hand, the words still echoing in his mind. You do now. Whoever had called him wasn't just issuing a warning, they were making a statement. He had helped Rebecca Hale for less than 15 minutes. And now someone wanted him to stay away from her, which meant one thing. She was in serious trouble. Ethan ran a hand over his jaw, exhaling sharply. He needed answers, and the only person who could give them to him was already gone. Back at the shop, another shadow appears. Ethan spent the next few hours at his auto shop, trying to keep his mind off the call. It didn't work. He had tried to look up Rebecca Hale online. Nothing. No social media, no professional records. It was like she didn't exist, which only made him more suspicious. Then just before closing time, a man walked in. Ethan barely looked up from the engine he was working on. We're about to close. The man didn't respond. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, finally glancing over. He was tall, built solid, dressed in dark jeans and a button-up shirt. Looked like he could handle himself in a fight. But what caught Ethan's attention? The man was looking around, not like a customer, like someone checking for exits. Ethan set down his tools. You lost? He asked. The man smiled. Just admiring your work. Ethan's gut tightened. He knew that tone. This wasn't about cars. And before Ethan could say another word, the man reached into his jacket. Ethan's body reacted before his brain caught up. In one motion, he grabbed the wrench off the workbench and swung. The man dodged back, but not fast enough. The wrench clipped his forearm, sending him stumbling. Ethan moved forward, but the man was already recovering. And then, he smirked, a slow, deliberate grin, like he was testing Ethan. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Ethan didn't follow, didn't need to, because now, he had his answer. Whoever these people were, they weren't just watching, they were testing him. And if tonight was a test, tomorrow would be a war. Ethan barely slept. His body was exhausted, but his mind was on fire. First, the black SUV outside his house. Then the phone call warning him to stay away from Rebecca Hale. And now, a man had walked into his shop not to get his car fixed, but to test him. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. Someone was watching him, pushing him, seeing what he'd do next. And Ethan wasn't about to just sit back and wait for answers. Early morning, looking for Rebecca. At sunrise, Ethan grabbed his keys and drove toward the spot where he had helped Rebecca the night before. Maybe she had left something behind. A clue, a direction, anything. But when he pulled onto the shoulder of the highway, there was nothing. No tire marks, no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. It was like the entire thing had been wiped clean. Ethan stepped out of his truck, hands on his hips, scanning the empty road. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. Then out of habit, he pulled out his phone and did a quick search. Rebecca Hale, Austin, Texas. A few results popped up. Most were generic names: a real estate agent, a yoga instructor, a college student. But nothing about the woman he had met. Then he tried. Rebecca Hale. Missing Rebecca Hale. FBI nothing. It was like she didn't exist. Ethan clenched his jaw, frustration rising. Either Rebecca was using a fake identity, or someone had gone through a lot of trouble to erase her past. And if it was the second option, then she wasn't just on the run. She was hiding from someone dangerous. Back at the auto shop, more unwanted visitors. By the time Ethan pulled into his shop, his mind was still spinning. But then he noticed something. A black sedan parked across the street. It wasn't the SUV from before, but it felt the same, like someone was watching him. Inside the shop, Ethan tried to act normal, keeping his hands busy, but his eyes kept flicking toward the window. And then, just as he expected, a man stepped out of the sedan, dressed in a dark suit, moving with a calm, controlled precision. Ethan's stomach tightened. This wasn't some random customer. This was something else. And whoever this man was, he was coming straight for him. Ethan watched the man approach. His movements were calm, deliberate, the kind of walk a person took when they weren't afraid of anything. That alone told Ethan everything he needed to know. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't lost. He wasn't a customer, and he damn sure wasn't friendly. Ethan didn't move from behind the counter as the man stepped inside the shop, the bell above the door jingling softly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The man took a slow look around, his eyes sweeping over the shelves of tools, the car Ethan had been working on, the dusty clock ticking on the wall. Then finally he turned to face Ethan. "You're Ethan Walker." Not a question, a statement. Ethan kept his face neutral. "Depends on who's asking." The man's lips quirked into a small smile. "You're a hard man to find," he said. "Quiet life, no family, few friends." He tilted his head. "No ties." Ethan's grip on the wrench in his hand tightened. "You always introduce yourself by listing off a man's personal history?" The man chuckled, shaking his head. "My name's Thomas Kane," he said. "I work for people who are concerned about the company you've been keeping." Ethan's gut tightened. Rebecca. This was about her. Still, he kept his voice level. "I don't know what you're talking about." Kane smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "That's disappointing," he said. "I was hoping you'd be cooperative." Ethan exhaled slowly, placing the wrench down on the counter. "I don't know who the hell you are," he said, "but you need to leave." Kane didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket. Ethan's muscles tensed. But Kane didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward Ethan. What Ethan saw made his blood run cold. It was a photo, a grainy security camera image, of him and Rebecca, standing by the side of the highway, the night he had helped her. Ethan's jaw tightened. "We know who she is," Kane said. "We know where she's been, and we know she came to you." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. "This is the last time I'm going to ask nicely," Kane continued. "Where is she?" Ethan's heartbeat was steady, controlled. But inside, he was calculating. Because now he wasn't just in trouble, he was in the middle of something much bigger. And the worst part? He still had no idea what the hell it was. Ethan didn't blink. He just stared at Thomas Kane, the man who had walked into his shop like he owned the place, who had just shown him a surveillance photo like it was a casual piece of evidence. But Ethan knew exactly what was happening. Kane was testing him, seeing if he'd crack, if he'd give up Rebecca Hale. Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't know where she is," he said, voice calm. "And even if I did, I wouldn't tell you." Kane's smile barely faltered. "Wrong answer," he murmured. The air between them shifted. Ethan felt it, the threat, the unspoken danger. Kane hadn't come alone. Ethan knew it before he even glanced toward the window. A second black SUV had pulled up across the street. A man in a dark suit leaned casually against the hood, arms crossed, watching him. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You come all the way out here just to shake me down?" he asked. Kane tapped the counter lightly, like he had all the time in the world. "I came here to give you a choice," he said. "You walk away from this now, and I pretend we never had this conversation." Ethan arched an eyebrow. "And if I don't?" Kane leaned in slightly. "Then things get very difficult for you, Mr. Walker." A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Then, Ethan smiled. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't amused. It was a warning. "You think I'm afraid of difficult?" he asked, voice dangerously low. Kane studied him for a long moment. Then finally he straightened, adjusted his jacket. "Well," he sighed, "I can see why she came to you." He took a step toward the door, but before he left, he turned back one last time. "I'll be seeing you, Walker." The bell above the door jingled as he walked out. Ethan didn't move, didn't exhale. Not until the black SUVs drove away. Then, and only then, did he finally let out a breath. Whatever Rebecca was running from, it wasn't just trouble. It was hell itself. Or that the night. The call. Ethan was in his shop long after closing, cleaning tools that didn't need cleaning. His mind was running at 100 miles per hour. Then, his phone buzzed, a number he didn't recognize. Ethan stared at it for a moment. Then he answered. Silence. Then, a voice. Software urgent. "Ethan, they found me." His breath caught. "Rebecca? I need your help." Then just before the line went dead, "They're coming." Ethan gripped the phone tighter. "Rebecca?" he said again, his voice low, controlled. The line crackled, then her voice came through, frantic, barely above a whisper. "I don't have much time. They're closing in." Ethan's gut tightened. "Where are you?" he asked. Silence, then a ragged breath. "Downtown, east side. There's a bus station." Static cut her off. Ethan stood up, already moving. "Rebecca," he said, "stay put. I'm coming." Then a sharp intake of breath, a noise in the background. Then her voice panicked, rushed. "Number, it's too late. They—" The call went dead. Ethan cursed under his breath, tossing his phone on the counter. His heart was pounding, but his mind was clear. He had a choice. Walk away. Forget about her. Let whatever was happening stay in the shadows. But that wasn't who he was. And something told him, if he didn't move now, she wouldn't live to see sunrise. Ethan grabbed his truck keys, his pistol, and a jacket, and he headed straight into the fire. The bus station, a city in the dark. The east side of Austin was alive with neon signs and streetlights, but the energy was different. It wasn't the part of town tourists went to. It was where people went to disappear. Ethan pulled up to the bus station, his truck idling. His eyes scanned the lot. It was mostly empty. Just a few people waiting on the benches, a bored clerk behind the ticket window. No sign of Rebecca, but there was a black SUV parked at the far end of the lot. Ethan's jaw clenched. He killed the engine, stepped out, and walked toward the benches. A homeless man sat nearby, bundled in an old coat. Ethan slid a 20 into his cup. "You see a woman here earlier? Blonde, nervous?" The man glanced at him, then toward the SUV. "Yeah," he muttered. "She was here. Couple of guys in suits showed up. She ran." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "Where?" The man shrugged. "Down that way." He pointed to a narrow alley between two old buildings. Ethan didn't hesitate. He took off running. The alley, a trap set in motion. The alley was dark, damp, and smelled like trash and desperation. Ethan moved fast, keeping low, his eyes darting between the shadows. Then, a sound. Footsteps. A figure stumbled out from behind a dumpster. Rebecca. Her clothes were dirty, her face pale. She saw Ethan and froze. "No, no, you shouldn't be here," she whispered. A car engine roared at the far end of the alley. Headlights flooded the darkness. A second black SUV. Doors slammed. Men stepped out, guns drawn. Ethan reached for his own weapon, stepping in front of Rebecca. No more warnings. No more games. This was war. The air in the alley thickened, the weight of the moment pressing down like a storm about to break. Ethan stood firm, his body shielding Rebecca as the black SUV's headlights flooded the narrow space. The doors swung open. Two men stepped out, both in dark suits, clean cut, but there was nothing polished about the way they moved. These weren't cops. These weren't government agents. These were killers. Ethan's hand tightened around the pistol at his hip. One of the men, the taller of the two, tilted his head, studying him. Then he spoke, his voice calm, controlled. "Walker." Ethan didn't respond. The man's lip twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You should have stayed out of this." Ethan exhaled slowly, keeping his stance loose but ready. "That an option?" he asked. The second man, shorter, stockier, chuckled, shaking his head. "Not anymore." Ethan didn't need to hear another word. He moved first. In one fluid motion, he drew his pistol and fired. The first shot ripped through the air, clipping the taller man's shoulder. He staggered back, cursing. The second man lunged, gun raised. Ethan dove left, grabbing Rebecca's wrist, pulling her with him. Gunfire exploded in the alley. Bullets slammed into the brick wall behind them, kicking up dust and debris. Ethan hit the ground hard, rolling behind a dumpster. Rebecca scrambled beside him, breathing heavily. "What now?" she whispered. Ethan checked his magazine. 3 rounds left. He glanced around, no exits. Just a dead end 50 feet behind them. Trapped. He let out a slow breath. "Stay low, and when I say run, run." Rebecca's eyes widened. "Ethan, trust me." She hesitated. Then finally she nodded. Ethan shifted his grip on his pistol, bracing himself. The men were advancing. This wasn't a fight he was going to win, but he wasn't here to win. He was here to get Rebecca out alive. And to do that, he had to make them chase him. Ethan counted his breaths. 3 shots left. 2 armed men. 1 narrow alley with nowhere to run. He felt Rebecca tense beside him, her breathing quick and uneven. She was scared. He needed to get her out of here, now. The taller man, still clutching his bleeding shoulder, barked out an order. "Walker, this doesn't end well for you. Give us the girl, and we let you walk away." Ethan let out a slow breath. "Not interested," the man sighed. "Shame." Then more footsteps. Ethan's stomach tightened. Another black SUV pulled up at the far end of the alley. Doors swung open. 3 more men stepped out. This just got worse. Rebecca's fingers dug into his arm. "Ethan," she whispered, "we're trapped." Not yet. Ethan's mind raced. He glanced at the fire escape bolted to the brick wall beside them. Rusty, unstable, but still there. He turned to Rebecca. "You climb, I cover." She shook her head. "I'm not leaving you." "Rebecca, now." She hesitated. Then she moved. As Rebecca scrambled up the ladder, Ethan stepped out from cover and fired. The gun kicked in his hand as the first bullet found its mark. The shorter man staggered back, clutching his leg, cursing. The other men dove for cover. Ethan fired again, his last two shots. Then, click. Empty. He cursed under his breath and ran. Above the alley, a desperate escape. Rebecca was already halfway up the fire escape, her hands slipping on the rusted railing. Come on, she whispered, pulling herself up. Below her, Ethan climbed fast. Bullets ripped into the metal steps, sending sparks flying. The men below weren't aiming to kill. They were aiming to capture. Ethan grabbed Rebecca's wrist, helping her onto the rooftop. They barely made it before one of the men shouted, "Go!" Ethan and Rebecca took off running, across the rooftop, through the night, away from the danger snapping at their heels. But Ethan knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over, not even close. The night air was thick and humid, clinging to Ethan's skin as he and Rebecca ran across the rooftop. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, his body moving on instinct. No plan, no direction, just run. Behind them, the men below shouted orders, their voices echoing through the alley. A gunshot rang out, too far to hit them, a warning shot. They didn't want Rebecca dead. They wanted her alive, and that meant one thing. She was valuable. They reached the far end of the rooftop, a gap between buildings. Ethan didn't slow down. He grabbed Rebecca's arm. Jump! She barely had time to react before he pulled her forward. They launched off the edge, landing hard on the next rooftop. Rebecca rolled, gasping, but she was alive. Ethan landed in a crouch, already pulling her to her feet. Keep moving, he said. They cut across the rooftop, down an old maintenance ladder, and into a narrow back street. The SUVs wouldn't be able to follow them here. They had a chance. They ran through the maze of alleys, turning corner after corner, until finally, they hit a dead end, a chain-link fence. Rebecca doubled over, hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath. Ethan turned, listening. No footsteps, no engines. For now they were alone, but not for long. Ethan took a step closer to her, his voice low, controlled. Start talking. Rebecca looked up, her face still pale, eyes wide. Ethan, we need to keep moving. Not until you tell me what the hell is going on. She swallowed, wiping sweat from her forehead. Then finally she spoke. I used to work for Richard Langley. Ethan's jaw tightened. Richard Langley. The name had been all over the news. A billionaire, powerful, untouchable, CEO of Langley Global, a massive company with contracts in defense, surveillance, and government technology. And, according to rumors, a man who had more secrets than the CIA. Ethan's voice was sharp. What did you do for him? Rebecca's breath hitched. I was a data analyst, she said. High security clearance. I had access to... She stopped, shaking her head. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. Ethan's stomach coiled. What did you see, Rebecca? She looked at him. Proof that Langley has been running illegal surveillance programs for years, hacking into government systems, tracking people. She exhaled. And now he wants me dead. Ethan absorbed Rebecca's words, his mind turning over every possible angle. Richard Langley, a billionaire, a ghost in the corporate world, and according to Rebecca, a man with his own secret surveillance network. Ethan let out a slow breath. You have proof? Rebecca nodded. I stole it. His jaw tightened. She wasn't just running. She was running with something worth killing for. Ethan's voice was flat. Where is it? Rebecca hesitated, glancing down the alleyway, like she expected someone to step out of the shadows. It's safe. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Safe where? She didn't answer. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. Rebecca, I just went from being a nobody to the next man on their hit list. If I'm going to help you, I need to know what I'm dealing with. Rebecca exhaled sharply, rubbing her arms like she was cold despite the Texas heat. I sent it to a contact, she said. Someone I trust. Ethan watched her carefully. Who? Rebecca hesitated again. Then finally. An investigative journalist. Ethan's gut tightened. This wasn't just some corporate scandal. This was a war. And now, Ethan was right in the middle of it. He pinched the bridge of his nose. Christ, Rebecca swallowed. Ethan, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for you to get pulled into this. Too late, he muttered. She bit her lip. I thought I could disappear, stay off the grid long enough for the story to break. But, her voice hitched. They found me. Ethan glanced at the empty street beyond the alleyway. They weren't safe here. They weren't safe anywhere. But before he could speak, the sound of tires screeching cut through the night. Rebecca stiffened. Ethan turned sharply. A black SUV sped past the alley entrance, slowing just enough for the driver to get a look inside. Then, it gunned the engine and vanished. Ethan's chest tightened. That wasn't a coincidence. They had been spotted. He grabbed Rebecca's arm. We need to move, now. She didn't argue. They took off, disappearing into the darkened streets, their hearts pounding. Because Ethan knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It was a countdown. And if they didn't stay ahead, they were already dead. The streets of Austin blurred as Ethan and Rebecca moved fast, ducking into alleys, cutting through parking lots. They couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not when the black SUVs were circling the area like predators closing in. Rebecca's breathing was shaky, her steps uneven, but Ethan kept her moving. Where are we going? She gasped. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He had one place in mind, a place off the grid, a place even he hadn't been in years. An hour later, the hideout. They reached the edge of town, far from the city lights. A rundown auto garage, abandoned for years, sat on an overgrown lot. Ethan had bought it a long time ago, a backup plan. Now, it was their only option. He unlocked the rusty side door and pushed it open. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and forgotten memories. Rebecca stepped in cautiously, wrapping her arms around herself. This place is charming, she muttered. Ethan grunted. It's safe. She glanced at him. For how long? Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he locked the door behind them. They had bought themselves time, but not much. The call, a dangerous gamble. Rebecca sat on an old workbench, rubbing her temples. We need to call my contact, she said. The journalist. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms crossed. And tell them what? That I'm alive, she said, and that I still have the evidence. Ethan's jaw tightened. If they reached out, it could mean help, or it could mean walking straight into a trap. Rebecca pulled out her phone. She hesitated, then dialed. The line rang twice. Then a voice answered. A man's voice. Rebecca, she exhaled sharply. Trey, it's me. Ethan watched her carefully. She trusted this man, but Ethan didn't trust anyone. Jesus, Rebecca, where the hell have you been? Trey's voice was urgent, tense. I had to disappear, she said. They found me. A pause, then, where are you? Ethan's eyes narrowed. Rebecca hesitated. Ethan shook his head. Don't tell him. Finally, she answered, I can't say, but I need your help. Another pause. Then Trey spoke, his voice lower this time. You don't understand, he said. Langley isn't just looking for you. He's already ahead of you. Rebecca's face drained of color. Ethan pushed off the wall. What the hell does that mean? Trey exhaled. It means your location isn't as secret as you think, he said. And if you don't move, they're coming. Rebecca's grip tightened on the phone. Her voice was low, controlled. Trey, what do you mean they're ahead of us? On the other end of the line, Trey hesitated. Then his voice dropped. Rebecca, I don't know how, but they know where you are. Ethan's gut tightened. He grabbed the phone from her and put it on speaker. How do you know that? Ethan asked, his voice sharp. Trey's breath hitched. Because I've been watching the same people who've been watching you, he admitted. Langley has a network, security teams, former government contractors. They don't just track people, they predict movements. Rebecca's face paled. Ethan's pulse kicked up. If that's true, Ethan said slowly, then why the hell are you still alive? Another pause. Then, Trey's voice turned cold. Because I didn't run, he said. I made a deal. Rebecca's breath caught. Ethan's muscles tensed. He had heard that tone before. a man who had already made his choice. Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. "Trey, what did you do?" Silence. Then, "I'm sorry." The line went dead. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. "Get down!" Before Rebecca could react, Ethan grabbed her and pulled her to the ground. A split second later, the garage windows shattered. Glass exploded as bullets ripped through the walls. Rebecca screamed, covering her head. Ethan shielded her, adrenaline surging as more gunfire tore through the building. They had been set up. Ethan's mind raced. The garage was a kill box. Nowhere to run. No back door. He gritted his teeth. There was one way out, but they'd have to move fast. He turned to Rebecca. "Stay close. When I say run, you run." She nodded, her body shaking. Ethan took a slow breath. Calm. Focused. Then, he grabbed an old wrench from the floor and hurled it at the light switch. The garage plunged into darkness. Gunfire paused for half a second, and that was all they needed. "Run!" Ethan and Rebecca bolted, through the back of the garage, straight into the night, straight into the unknown. Ethan and Rebecca sprinted into the night, the sound of gunfire still ringing in their ears. The garage was compromised. Trey had sold them out. And now, Langley's men weren't watching anymore. They were hunting. Rebecca's breath hitched, her steps uneven as they cut through the overgrown lot behind the garage. Where are we going?" she gasped. Ethan didn't answer, because the truth, he didn't know. All he knew was that they had to disappear. Now reaching the truck, a narrow escape. The only chance they had was Ethan's pickup truck, parked a few blocks away in an abandoned lot. If they could get to it, they might be able to get ahead of the chase. Ethan tugged Rebecca forward, pushing their pace. They rounded a corner, slipping into the shadows of a narrow alley. The truck was just ahead, almost there. Then, the sound of tires screeching. Rebecca froze. Ethan's stomach dropped. A black SUV barreled toward them, headlights blinding in the darkness. "Run!" Ethan yanked Rebecca to the side, just as the vehicle swerved, trying to block them in. They hit the pavement hard, rolling out of the way as the SUV skidded to a stop. The doors flew open. Men stepped out, guns raised. Ethan's heart pounded. They had nowhere left to run. Ethan's mind moved fast. 3 men, armed, blocking the only path to the truck. No cover, no time. And Rebecca, she was too exhausted to run. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. They had to fight. The lead gunman stepped forward, his voice cold and calm. "Walker," he said, "you're done. Drop the weapon. Give us the girl." Ethan's grip tightened on his pistol. "Yeah," he muttered. "Come take her." The man sighed. "Don't be stupid." Ethan moved first. In a blur of motion, he grabbed a discarded brick from the alley floor and threw it. The lead gunman flinched, a fraction of a second. It was enough. Ethan fired twice. The first bullet hit the lead man in the leg. He crumpled with a curse. The second shot whizzed past another attacker, sending him scrambling for cover. Rebecca gasped, pressing herself against the alley wall. Ethan grabbed her arm. "Move!" They dashed for the truck, bullets ripping into the pavement behind them. Ethan threw the door open, shoving Rebecca inside. He barely got behind the wheel before a third gunman rushed forward. Ethan slammed the door just in time. A gunshot shattered the side mirror. Rebecca screamed. Ethan gritted his teeth, turned the key. The engine roared to life. He didn't hesitate, didn't think. He stomped the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, clipping the last gunman just as he fired another shot. Ethan barely noticed. All that mattered was getting the hell out of there. On the road. The truth comes out. They were miles away before anyone spoke. Ethan's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his breath coming slow, controlled. Rebecca sat in the passenger seat, her hands shaking. Finally, Ethan glanced at her. "You ready to tell me what's really in those files?" Rebecca swallowed hard. Then in a hushed voice, she said, "Proof that Langley isn't just spying on people." She took a slow breath. "He's tracking government officials, judges, journalists, senators. Her voice dropped even lower. He's controlling them, blackmailing them, and if the files get out, half the country's leadership goes down with him. Ethan's chest tightened. This wasn't just corporate corruption. This was something else entirely. This was power at its highest level. And now? Now Ethan wasn't just running for Rebecca's life. He was running for his own. The highway stretched dark and empty, nothing but the hum of the truck's engine and the weight of Rebecca's confession hanging in the air. Ethan kept his grip tight on the wheel, his mind racing. Blackmail, judges, senators. Langley wasn't just a billionaire. He was pulling the strings of the country itself. And Rebecca? She had stolen the one thing that could bring him down. Ethan let out a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. "Where's the data now?" Rebecca hesitated. "Then, it's with Trey." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Trey? The same guy who just sold us out?" Rebecca nodded, rubbing her arms. "I didn't tell him exactly what I had. I only said I had proof. I sent it to him in pieces, encrypted. But now," she looked at Ethan, "if they got to him, they have it." Ethan's pulse kicked up. That meant they had two options. Get to Trey before Langley's men did, or assume they already had, and burn it all down. Elsewhere, the trap is set. Inside a dimly lit boardroom, Richard Langley sat at the head of a long glass table, fingers tapping lightly on the armrest of his leather chair. The black SUVs had failed. The men he'd sent weren't answering. That meant one thing. Walker was proving to be more trouble than expected. Langley exhaled, eyes flicking to the screens in front of him. Surveillance feeds, satellite images, every digital footprint Rebecca Hale had ever left. His network was everywhere. And now, it was closing in. A phone buzzed on the table. Langley answered without hesitation. "Do we have them?" A voice on the other end. "Not yet," the man said. "But we have something better." Langley leaned forward. "Trey Matthews," the man continued. "He knows where they're going, and he's willing to talk." Langley's lips curled into a slow, satisfied smile. "Good," he murmured. "Then let's make sure Walker and Hale walk straight into our hands." Back on the road. A desperate plan. Ethan pulled the truck onto a side road, heading away from the main highway. Rebecca frowned. "Where are we going?" "To get ahead of them." Rebecca stared at him. Ethan's voice was calm, measured. "If Trey's compromised, they already know we'll come looking for him. That means they'll be waiting." Rebecca swallowed hard. "Then why are we going?" Ethan pulled the truck to a stop. "Because I don't run." The truck rumbled to a stop outside a rundown gas station on the outskirts of town. Rebecca shifted nervously in her seat. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Because no, he wasn't sure. But at this point, he didn't have a choice. "Trey's expecting you to come alone," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If Langley's men are already with him, this is a trap." Ethan exhaled slowly, staring through the windshield at the darkened lot ahead. Trap or not, he needed answers. "Stay low, stay close," he said. "If something goes wrong—" Rebecca grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "If something goes wrong," she said, "we don't leave each other behind." Ethan held her gaze for a beat longer than he should have. Then he nodded. "Let's move." Inside the gas station, a deal with the devil. The neon lights flickered, buzzing faintly as Ethan and Rebecca stepped inside. The place was half abandoned, shelves mostly empty, the clerk behind the counter barely paying attention. Trey sat at the back, in a booth near the window, and across from him, two men in suits. Ethan recognized one immediately. Thomas Kane. Rebecca stiffened beside him. Trey looked up, his face pale, his hands twitching slightly on the table. "Ethan," he said, forcing a weak smile. "Glad you made it." Kane leaned back in his seat, looking almost bored. "Walker," he greeted, "took you long enough." Ethan kept his stance loose, but his mind was running through a dozen different ways this could go sideways. "Let's skip the pleasantries," Ethan said, his voice flat. "What's the play here?" Kane smirked, tossing a USB drive onto the table. Rebecca stared at it. "The files," Kane said. "We have them now, which means we don't need her anymore." Rebecca's face drained of color. Trey wouldn't meet her eyes. Ethan's grip tightened at his side. "So what now?" he asked. "You kill us and call it a day?" Kane smiled. "Not at all," he said smoothly. "Langley wants you both alive." Ethan glanced at Trey. The man looked ready to crawl out of his own skin. He was scared. That meant there was still a chance. Ethan's mind raced. They weren't walking out of here peacefully, which meant he had to start the fight before they did. The air inside the gas station was thick with tension. Ethan could feel it, the shift before the storm. Thomas Kane sat calmly, the USB drive sitting on the table like a loaded weapon. Rebecca stood frozen beside him, her breath uneven. Trey refused to meet her eyes. And the two men sitting across from him? They weren't just Langley's employees. They were cleaners. Men whose job wasn't to negotiate. It was to eliminate problems. Ethan's grip tightened at his side. He had one shot to flip this situation. One move before bullets started flying. Kane leaned back, studying him. "You don't look surprised, Walker." Ethan kept his voice steady. "That you're screwing us over?" He exhaled. "Yeah, I saw this coming." Kane smirked. "Good. Then you know how this ends." Ethan let his fingers drift toward his belt. He had one knife, one gun, but the gun was useless. Too many eyes on him. That left the knife. Kane followed the movement, his smirk widening. "You really want to do this?" Ethan rolled his shoulders, loosening up. "Not really," he admitted, "but I don't see a way around it." Kane's amusement flickered. For a split second, his eyes moved toward Trey. That was Ethan's opening. He moved first. The fight begins. In one fluid motion, Ethan grabbed the USB drive off the table and slammed the edge into Kane's face. The impact sent Kane reeling back, cursing. Rebecca gasped, stumbling backward as the two gunmen reached for their weapons. Ethan didn't give them the chance. He grabbed Trey's half-empty coffee mug and threw it into the closest man's face. The gunman jerked back, giving Ethan just enough time to grab the knife from his belt. A quick slash. Blood hit the table. The second man shouted, lunging forward. Rebecca reacted on pure instinct. She grabbed the hot coffee pot from the counter and smashed it against the gunman's arm. He howled in pain, his gun clattering to the ground. Trey was shaking, frozen in place. Kane wiped blood from his nose, his calm demeanor gone. "You son of a—" Ethan kicked the table over, using it as cover as he grabbed Rebecca's wrist. "Move!" They bolted toward the back exit, footsteps pounding behind them. Gunfire erupted. Bullets shattered the front windows, sending glass spraying in every direction. Ethan shoved Rebecca forward, throwing open the back door. They were almost free. Then, a black SUV skidded into the alley behind the gas station. More men, more guns. No way out. The black SUV screeched to a halt, blocking the alley. Doors flew open. More gunmen stepped out, weapons raised and ready. Ethan's mind raced. The gas station was a death trap. They were outgunned, outnumbered, out of time. Rebecca grabbed his arm. "Ethan, what do we do?" For a split second, Ethan considered surrendering. But then he saw Kane grinning through the broken window, blood dripping from his nose. And he knew. Langley didn't want them alive. He wanted them eliminated. There was no surrender, only survival. Ethan grabbed Rebecca's wrist. "Run!" Trey's choice, redemption or betrayal. Inside the gas station, Trey watched the chaos unfold. Kane had pulled himself up, breathing hard, his expression livid. "Idiots," he muttered. "Just shoot them already." Trey's hands shook. This wasn't what he signed up for. He had made a deal, to save himself. But this was murder. His gaze flicked to the gun on the floor. He had a choice, and only seconds to make it. Kane turned toward him. "Trey, get your ass out there and help." Trey exhaled shakily. Then he grabbed the gun and pointed it at Kane. Kane froze. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Trey's grip tightened. Something right for once. Then he pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the gas station, and Kane dropped to the floor. The alley, a last stand. Ethan and Rebecca had nowhere left to go. The SUV blocked the only exit. The gunman closed in. Rebecca pressed herself against the wall, eyes darting around for any way out. Ethan stepped in front of her, jaw clenched. If this was it, if this was where it ended, then he was taking some of them with him. One of the gunmen raised his weapon. Ethan braced himself. Then, bang! A gunshot rang out. But it wasn't aimed at Ethan. The gunman staggered back, blood spraying from his shoulder. More shots followed, forcing the other men to dive for cover. Ethan's eyes snapped toward the gas station. Trey. He stood in the shattered doorway, gun smoking, hands steady. Go! He shouted. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Rebecca's hand and sprinted toward the SUV. More gunfire erupted, but this time, it wasn't just aimed at them. Trey was fighting back, buying them just enough time. Ethan yanked open the SUV's door, shoving Rebecca inside. Then, he hit the gas. The tires screeched as they tore out of the alley, bullets bouncing off the metal. As they sped away, Ethan glanced in the mirror. Trey was still firing, holding them off. But for how long? Ethan's chest tightened. Trey had just signed his death warrant, but thanks to him, they were still alive. For now. The SUV roared down the empty highway, its engine the only sound cutting through the tense silence inside the cabin. Ethan's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. Rebecca sat beside him, shaking, her breathing uneven. They had escaped, barely. But Trey, Ethan's jaw clenched. He had seen men like Trey before. Men who realized too late that they had picked the wrong side. Men who tried to fix their mistakes. Most of them didn't live long enough to see if it worked. Rebecca swallowed hard. Do you think... Ethan didn't let her finish. He knew what he was doing. Rebecca pressed her lips together. That doesn't mean it was right. It didn't, but it bought them time. And right now, that was all that mattered. Elsewhere, the fallout Trey sat slumped against the gas station wall, his chest rising and falling in uneven gas. Blood pooled beneath him. His gun was empty. The last gunman stood over him, reloading his pistol. Trey let out a weak laugh. Guess I didn't think this through. The man aimed the gun at him. Trey closed his eyes. Then, a voice. Stop! The gunman hesitated. Thomas Kane, bleeding but alive, pushed himself up from the floor. He wiped the blood from his mouth, his expression unreadable. Take him! The gunman frowned. Langley said... Kane cut him off. Langley doesn't know everything, he said. His gaze locked onto Trey. Walker and Hale think you're dead. Kane's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. Let's use that. Back on the road. The last chance Ethan turned onto a deserted road, headlights cutting through the dark. Where are we going? Rebecca asked. Ethan kept his eyes ahead. The only place left. Rebecca frowned. What does that mean? Ethan exhaled. It means we're done running. Rebecca's eyes widened. Ethan, we take the fight to Langley, he said, before he takes it to us. Rebecca hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. Then let's end this. Ethan kept his hands steady on the wheel, the SUV slicing through the Texas night. The time for running was over. Now, it was time to end this. Rebecca sat beside him, her breath slow but controlled. She was scared. Anyone would be, but she was ready. You really think this will work? She asked. Ethan didn't hesitate. No. Rebecca blinked, startled. Then why are we doing it? Ethan exhaled. Because it's the only play we have left. She nodded, accepting the answer for what it was. A gamble, a suicide mission. But better to die fighting than die running. Elsewhere, the trapped titans inside a high-rise penthouse overlooking downtown Austin, Richard Langley stood before a massive floor-to-ceiling window, swirling a glass of whiskey. Behind him, Thomas Kane entered, his expression grim. They're coming, Kane said. Langley smiled. Good, he murmured. Kane hesitated. There's something else, he said. Trey, he's still alive. Langley's smile didn't falter. Perfect, he said. Use him. Kane raised an eyebrow. Langley turned, his blue eyes cold, calculating. Walker and Hale need to believe they're in control. He set down his glass. And Trey will help them walk straight into my hands. Kane nodded. The game was almost over, and Langley always won. Back on the road, The last call. Ethan's phone buzzed. He hesitated, then answered. Trey? A beat of silence. Then, Trey's voice weak, pained. Ethan, I screwed up. Rebecca sat bolt upright. Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel. Where are you? Another pause, then, they have me, but I know where Langley is. Ethan's heart pounded. Tell me. Static crackled on the line. Then, Trey's voice barely a whisper. Downtown, Langley's penthouse, 86th floor. Ethan exhaled sharply. We're on our way. He hung up. Rebecca stared at him. Ethan, this is a setup. Ethan nodded. Yeah. He hit the gas. But we're going anyway. Because Trey might be a trap. But Langley was real. And tonight, he dies. The city lights of downtown Austin stretched out below them, glittering against the night sky. Ethan pulled the SUV into an underground parking garage, killing the engine. Rebecca sat beside him, jaw tight, fist clenched. Last chance to turn around, she murmured. Ethan didn't move. Not happening. She nodded, because they both knew. This ended tonight. Ethan checked his gear. One pistol, one knife. Not much, but it would have to be enough. Rebecca had a small, concealed weapon. But more than that, she had the drive Langley thought he had taken from her. She had made a copy. And now, it was going straight to the world. Ethan turned to her. We go in. We don't stop until we reach Langley. Rebecca swallowed. And Trey? Ethan exhaled. If he's still alive, he said, we get him out. Rebecca looked at him, searching his face. Then she nodded. Let's go. Inside the penthouse, a deadly welcome. The 86th floor of the Langley Global Tower was silent. Too silent. Ethan's instincts screamed at him. They stepped into the marble-floored hallway, their footsteps barely making a sound. Ahead, a set of double doors loomed. Langley's office. Ethan checked the corners, gun raised. Then, the lights flickered, and a voice echoed through the speakers. Langley's voice, calm, smooth, controlled. Walker, Hale, you've made it this far. I have to say, I'm impressed. Rebecca stiffened beside him. Ethan didn't slow. He stepped forward, pressing against the doors. Locked. Of course. Langley chuckled softly. But now what? A mechanical click sounded. Then, gunfire exploded through the hallway. Ethan grabbed Rebecca and dived for cover. Bullets tore into the walls, shattering glass. The ambush was already waiting. Langley had known. Langley had always known. Ethan gritted his teeth. They were walking straight into a death trap. But there was no turning back now. This was it. This was the end. Gunfire ripped through the hallway, bullets tearing into the walls, sending shards of glass and debris flying. Ethan and Rebecca hugged the ground, pinned behind a metal column as Langley's security team closed in. Ethan checked his ammo. 4 rounds left. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Rebecca's breath was shaky, but she forced herself to stay focused. We're trapped, she whispered. Ethan's mind raced. They needed a distraction, something to turn the odds. Then, a voice rang out. Hey! Ethan's head snapped toward the end of the hallway. Trey, bloodied, limping, but alive, and holding a gun. Before Langley's men could react, Trey opened fire. Bullets slammed into the security team, forcing them into cover. It was the break Ethan and Rebecca needed. Move! Ethan barked. They surged forward, taking out the last 2 guards with quick, precise shots. Then, the hallway was silent. Ethan turned to Trey, his gun still raised. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Trey gave a weak smile. I owed you one. Ethan exhaled sharply, lowering his weapon. Yeah, you did. Rebecca grabbed Trey's arm, steadying him. Langley? She asked. Trey jerked his head toward the double doors. Inside, but he's not alone. Ethan reloaded his weapon. Then let's finish this. Inside Langley's office, the final confrontation. The doors swung open. Langley stood at his massive glass desk, swirling a drink in one hand. Unbothered. Unshaken, like he was still in control. Two bodyguards stood nearby, armed. But Ethan wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Langley, the man who had started all of this. Rebecca stepped forward. "It's over." Langley chuckled. "Is it?" He gestured toward the massive screen behind him. It showed security footage of the entire building. Dozens of men, waiting, watching, coming. Ethan's stomach tightened. Langley smiled. "You think you've won?" he asked. "I own this city. I own men in power, men who make the rules. You can't touch me." Rebecca held up the second USB drive. "The world will see everything," she said. Langley sighed. "That's cute," he said, "but you still have to get out alive." He raised his hand, a silent order to his guards. But before they could fire, Trey shot first. A clean shot, straight through Langley's shoulder. The billionaire staggered back, screaming. Ethan moved fast, disarming the first bodyguard, knocking him cold. Rebecca grabbed the second gun and leveled it at Langley. "Call them off!" Langley clutched his bleeding shoulder, laughing through the pain. "Or what?" he sneered. "You'll kill me? Go ahead, it won't change anything." Rebecca's hands shook. Ethan placed a hand on her arm. "No, but this will—" He pressed a button on the desk. Langley's security feed switched to a live stream. Every camera in the building, now broadcasting to the world. The proof, the evidence, everything. Rebecca's eyes widened. "You hacked his system?" Ethan gave a small smirk. "Guess Langley's not the only one who plans ahead." Langley's face drained of color. He had lost. Finally. The aftermath. A new beginning. By the time the authorities arrived, Langley was in handcuffs. His empire was crumbling. The media was eating him alive. Ethan and Rebecca stood outside, watching it all unfold. Trey leaned against the SUV, exhausted but alive. Rebecca turned to Ethan. "It's over." Ethan exhaled. "Maybe for now." She frowned. "You don't think—" He cut her off. "Men like Langley always have backup plans." Rebecca's stomach twisted. "Then what do we do?" Ethan looked at the horizon, the sun just beginning to rise. He shrugged. "We stay ready,